Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I am your host, John Jewett.
And I am your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. The death to open bodybuilding. No one wants to get huge anymore. What's the deal? Luke and I saw, and now this is coming out after Tampa's happened, we just saw the Tampa lineup, but nonetheless, like even the last lineups of open bodybuilding throughout these summer shows, there's less than 10 guys. So what is going on? And we're going to give you our opinions around it. Luke, how you doing, man?
Good. I think you've let that early Halloween decoration shopping kind of bias that intro a bit with the death of bodybuilding.
well, I went. Renee and I went to Home Depot, and it is July, and or August now, right? There's already Halloween decorations out. They had like a 15-foot tall like mummy and like Frankenstein thing. I'm like, it's the summer. I came in from outside. It's like 98 degrees, and there's Halloween decorations.
Oh, man.
That's wild, right?
How disappointed is Renee that we'll be in Orlando for Halloween before we hop into this?
She is pretty sad about it. She's like, because she'd already been talking about, I'm going all in on Halloween at the house. Like, we're going to have like a haunted forest. And she was excited. We'll watch all the scary movies. And because we had a really good Halloween in 2021. But anyway, I'm like, it's okay. There's going to be Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that's where all the good eats are. She's like, yeah, it's all good. So,
oh goodness. To get back to the topic at hand, is the scary reality of potentially open starting to die. I think there's a couple of interesting points within this discussion that tend to push open away from certain people, and I think one that you brought up was the length of last year's competitive season. I know that was kind of potentially like a short-term explanation as to why we're seeing this. I think there's also some long-term direction discussions to have, but how much do you think that last year's like season duration is playing into how little we're kind of seeing these classes be from like a size standpoint?
Well, I think it is impactful because to a degree, and also the last Olympia was wild. Like I had a classic physique guy competing, and there was like, what was it, 50 something guys in classic on stage. It was kind of ridiculous because the qualification season was really long. You rewind back to 2021, the Olympia was in October, and then they pushed the Olympia for 2022 to December. So you had over 12 months for a qualification year, which is longer than usual, also allows for more shows to be included within that span. And we'll get into it, but we also still had a point system. So you had a lot of guys showing up to the Olympia and a very long season to qualify. So I think you could have guys that were earlier on qualifying, then having to do kind of this mini off season back into a prep, or you had guys running the gauntlet, right? Show after show after show. And finally they get to the Olympia, but man, to turn around and then look at your calendar year for 2023 and say like, oh wow, I need to qualify by September again. This leaves me no off season because you now have from like December, if you did that Olympia, to like when might you have to start even a prep for that? Some guys are starting prep right now, right? July. So you're looking at a 5-month maybe off season. And I think you have guys coming off that Olympia stage of like, welp, I was 16th place. What should I do now? It's like, well, I need time just to improve. And I think that pulled a lot of competitors out. I'm thinking more along the lines of classic for how many guys show up, but still all divisions were stacked out. Like 212, there was almost 30 guys. I forget the actual count in open, but it was a very large amount. So I think there's some impact there, but if you go back, it's still not as the depth of if we rewound all the way back to say even mid 2000s or especially early 2000s before you had some of the other divisions that are around.
Yeah, I think that's where the conversation of is classic taking over and why is it taking over if that's the case and what we think. Because for me, I think it's partly classic is a large push from a generational perspective. Like this generation that's coming up into competing in the pro ranks has a lot of desire to kind of be in the classic ranks just from like the exposure to social media and just that desire. But I also think from a health perspective, people are just not willing to take it to be an open competitor anymore. And that's where you're seeing these guys like squeeze into classic when if they just let themselves continue to live a bodybuilding lifestyle and push it as much as they possibly could, at some point they'd be open competitors.
We see guys move that way too. Do you think it's tough because I don't want to say like classic is like the stepstone to open, because classic in and of itself is extremely competitive, because you think you have some of those guys that have some of the best like genetic structure and shape are in classic, and that makes it for one very competitive, but also the numbers are huge. And I think do you think it's the quick early entry point when you don't have the muscle development to see out the open, or do you really think it's just the preference for a lot of guys?
I think preference is a smaller portion of the equation than the early entry point, because I think what ends up happening is you do well in classic, you are competitive, you win your pro card pretty quickly, you find that you're almost there in the pro class and you just need a little bit of improvement. Then you start getting potentially paid sponsorships and you're making a living being a bodybuilder, being in that top 10-ish echelon of classic competitors, and it just kind of makes it hard to leave. And I think that's potentially kind of where people are striving to do that, because you're getting early success, which then rewards the athlete for what they're doing and pursuing and doesn't allow them to see that the actual need is time away from that reward system to get into a different class.
Yeah, like you do see a younger crowd, like when I got into bodybuilding, you're younger, right? So the only avenue to go was bodybuilding. There was no other option. I mean, to go back in time and compete, I guess classic would have been appealing, right? It just fits your current place where you're at. Like you can be probably more competitive earlier on, and being that a lot of younger guys don't have the development yet, it just caters to a younger crowd. So you'll see those young guys quickly excel. Guys that are now like under 30 years old that are pros in classic. And so who do the young guys look to? The younger pros, the ones that they can relate best to. So it just all in all pulls a younger demographic. Also, I think that sways even like, it's just what people aesthetically prefer too. It's more relatable, not more relatable because they're still very muscular, but if we saw those same guys in open, just more developed, it might be different. But I think that has swayed like the younger crowd around, where they want to put their time into. I mean, damn, like C-Bum is nearly like mainstream famous, right? And you have a lot of younger guys that they all want to be C-Bum.
He's doing these interviews on podcasts that are like mainstream media platforms, right? Like, and that's kind of where you start to see, I don't want to say everybody wants to be the next C-Bum, because I don't think that's the case, but I think that they look to that as a inspirational figure of like, hey, this is what the future looks like in fitness. I don't think they're too far off. And as far as, when we talk about the back end business of bodybuilding and how people could potentially make careers in fitness of some sort, is potentially having that kind of a role of being a more of a appeal to a larger audience.
Do you think culturally the generation is a different place as well from when? Hell, Luke, you're almost in that age bracket. Like I'm 37, so I know that's not a huge difference, but like my generation, like coming up, like early 90s, right? That was the muscle area. Like I was just watching a documentary on Netflix, American Gladiator. Like that was like kicking hard then. Like it was all about a muscle. Stallone, like Arnold, like big muscle, like over masculized. Like that was like our early inspirations as kids. And then you see bodybuilding, which Arnold is like mainstream famous at that time. And you're like, wow, you like are captivated by it. But I think just mainstream, you've even seen a shift away from guys that are heavily muscled into guys that are more aesthetics, different characteristics, right? They're not the, Van Dammes and the freaking oiled up, Stallones. Just a quick, like total off tangent, but it's funny. I walked in the house and Renee's like watching Over the Top with Stallone, right? They're in like the truck stop and everyone's just chilling, right? Then all of a sudden it's like 80s music blaring, everyone's oiled up in tank tops. It's like it was a terrible 80s, but that was it, right? Like it was all about show and muscle. And I think that was a big influence in like the younger culture that I grew up on. And it's very different for younger culture now. And so I wonder how that has impacted like where people want to go to, because they don't have that like overly muscularized mainstream culture anymore.
Yeah, and it's almost demonized at this point with kind of where the culture is headed, right? I think that's kind of where you potentially are seeing that. But just like if you look at general culture as a whole, but I think too, something that overlays on top of this is the business and health aspect of it. I've mentioned the business part before, but just even having conversations with some of my athletes, it's like I have someone in mind who, in particular, who I won't mention, that they're talking about how like they push the limits of what their sponsor wants them to be for a lot of the ad shoots that they do and all this other kind of stuff. And if they take it too much further, that, it could potentially mean not fitting into that brand as well anymore. And it's like, if you start getting to the point where you're successful enough to have an audience and make money through these sponsorships, and this is potentially a decent chunk of your living, it's also further incentive to not chase that next category or class that is, a little bit more of a freak aspect that could take you out of the conversations in some of these businesses.
Yeah, I think if you are getting up that high in bodybuilding, the financial aspects will be there from purely a competitive standpoint, but it seems they're much farther and fewer between. But also the pool in classic is much bigger too. So there's its own issues within that, as their contracts can only go out so much. And I will say that the contracts are a lot smaller than what they used to be. So for us to sit here and say, yeah, you're going to like, I have a guy who's like, yeah, I want to turn pro. That's what I want to do for a living. It's like, that's what the rare few do for a living that actually get a substantial income from, hey, I just look good and that's all I do. Like sponsors don't give out money like that anymore. It's like, what value can you provide? And so you need some type of large influence over an audience, or maybe you're an educator and you provide value in that sense. But with classic, that's the thing, is that it is now more appealing to mainstream and draws that audience in, so you can have a lot of influence, while there's a lot of pro open bodybuilders that are complete freaks, but they have just no following and influence because it's maybe they don't run the best social media game, or they're not quite in that upper echelon. But I have a classic pro that is not in the upper echelon yet. And he's like, I've seen some of his contract stuff. Like you look pretty and you have like all the physique aspects. Like you're probably more liable to get a contract of some sort in that sense than being the open, super muscular guy. Potentially. And that I think that alludes to some of the other aspects of why there might be less competitors. But I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that for once we get into some other topics around money. But
yeah, and I think that the culture aspect is the part that I kind of left out, that I almost see classic as a catch-all now, where it's like you could live the lifestyle and the look of being a classic competitor without competing and have all of this type of a stuff. So it's almost, minus the top few, irregardless of their placing, if you have enough of a following and a influence and a social aspect and those kinds of things, right? So,
well, that's my point. I was like saving it, but you're right. Now you can make money without competing. We have lots of people that have just amazing influences on social and leave the competitive scene because there's more money doing that. And I'll tell you right now, like Luke and I were having a conversation off camera just about me working, because on prep, like, gosh, I maybe work 4 or 5 hours a day, which directly competing doesn't make me the money. My business does. And if I had more time to put into that, that might grow more. So it depends where you're at in the competitive world for sure. Like how high up are you? But for some of those guys, you start making money and realize like, man, I can just make money through social and my influence to where I don't need to compete. And that's why you see some guys not competing as often potentially. And that goes for open guys as well, right?
Yeah, I agree 100% because they can just hang out there and do their thing and put more time into the things that actually reward them more. Because, I mean, I don't know if you want to bring this point up now, but the prize money ain't that great unless you're winning the Olympia.
Yeah, no, it's not. Like, it's some people like or they talk shit, right? Or about, I posted up my Atlanta picture, right? And like we're holding the check for like 212 is usually like first place $5,000, which whatever, it's $5,000. That's great. Thank you to the promoter. That's amazing. I prize money hasn't really increased much in a while. For an open bodybuilder, you maybe get 10,000. That's kind of usually the standard that's around there. These are for your main shows. So to say like, oh yeah, you guys should go compete again to pick up another paycheck. It's like, it's only one guy that's really getting a decent check. And it's liable that you already spent that on your hotel, your airfare, and everything to compete. Because for having my videographer out there and everything I spent with my wife and everything, it was $5,000, like for sure. And so that's a wash. So we're not competing for the paychecks is what I would say. For one, I compete because I absolutely love it. If there's a paycheck associated, hell yeah, that's even better. But yeah, don't think like, man, these bodybuilders they're so broke. Like they're wasting their time. It's like the prize winnings is not how we are providing for ourselves. But even to go to the open, it's not like you're all of a sudden going to have a huge pay raise outside of maybe a very small few that are in the top 5 of like an Arnold and Olympia. The rest of the guys are might as well be any other competitor, right? Like if you're wellness or bikini, like, cause even Renee, she got second place in Austin. That was $2,000, which is not that far off from like 212 money, right? I think first place was 3,500. So, I mean, no one's getting rich off their first place wins, especially when you can only they do it a couple times a year. But the prize money has not increased in quite some time. But I don't think that's one of the big influences though, because of just what I said. We compete because we absolutely love it. I think it's probably more of the other reasons around it, that there is money to be made elsewhere. And I think earlier on, that amount of prize money maybe went a little farther. I was talking with Milos because he used to he did every show, you know? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was like prize money. I think people just ran the circuits, but I think back then there wasn't social media. I think that's a huge thing around it. So if you were like in magazines and getting talked about in that sense, that's where you could get those bigger contracts. So I think it was a different means to have to go about promoting yourself to make money, because the competitive realm in open was like, that's how you had to do it. But now it's a very different landscape.
Yeah. Now, the elephant in the room for most people is typically the health conversation, which I'm going to make the argument that from a drugs perspective, it's not too differential between open and classic as far as like compound use and those kinds of things. I think potentially where people start to concern about the health issues is just carrying around that weight and managing that, and kind of what that looks like. And how much do you think that, given the last couple of years, health issues are kind of playing into that decision making of people not pursuing open as well?
Very well. It could be a huge potential. For one, with social media, there's a ton more awareness around what we do, the health consequences around what we do. So I think, for one, people are more informed and educated. I think it's kind of like, back in like the 50s, you'd smoke a cigarette and that was like cool, right? And there was nothing around like health consequences. You just had this imagery of like, oh yeah, we all want to be cool. You'd see like an open body and be like, this is wild. When my old neighbor came and he was going to teach me like my first training program, right? He brought a Flex magazine. He's told me every guy in this magazine is on steroids. So that's the only way you're going to look like this. It was like the most honest conversation I had. I was, how old was I then? I think I was 13. I was in seventh grade. So back then, you look at a magazine, you just kind of were clueless, right? Like, it was like the cigarette ads. Like, yeah, that looks cool. Like, what do you do for that? But now we're like very well aware of what it is. You're very well aware of the risk of smoking cigarettes, right? Well, now we're very well of the risk of like steroid usage and where that heads and deaths that occurred around things like that. So I think that it very much is a deterrent for many people. Like, how many people smoke cigarettes now? If you see someone, you're like, what are you doing? Like, that absolutely does cause cancer. But yeah, it's not the same comparison with steroid use, but I think from an awareness point of view, there's something to that. Would you agree on the awareness point of like just information that's out there?
Yeah, I think the awareness point, it does make it a little bit harder for people to transition. I do think that it does bring about a section of clients that want their cake and eat it too. They're like, oh, I like open, but I know all these health risks with PEDs. It's like, I can get there without, large dosing of these PEDs, right? And it's like, well, unless you're the genetic elite, which the genetic elite are the top of the food chain already in the Olympia, which is, most of the time not, the person who's asking that question in the first place. It's probably going to take quite a bit, and you're going to have to take on some risk to get to that level of a competitor, right? And it's not risk that would be taken without need. So like bringing that client along the journey of only escalating based off need, but it's the reality of pursuing that end goal. And it sometimes becomes a little bit of a kick in the face to have that realization. And that's where I've seen a lot of people who come to me originally wanting to pursue open bodybuilding and then look at their work ethic for how long they've been doing it, their genetic capacity, kind of aligned along the PED conversation, and they reel it back into competing in classic because they don't feel like the open category is possible. And I think that's where potentially some of the education starts to limit people as well. Is you ever heard of like, sometimes you just have to be naive to achieve something and not fully understand what it takes to get there? I think that naivete is starting to be washed away, and people are just set with the hard reality of it, and at the end of the day decide against it.
So you're saying being a bit more of a bro and just like, yeah, coach, do whatever it takes.
Yeah.
might get you there. I remember like when I was first started like chasing the pro card down, right? It's just, this is what you do. Like, okay. Didn't have to think past the next like 10 years of what that looked like. And so when you're young, you're risk adverse and you're willing to do what it takes. I think once you get into that level of competition, everyone's pretty much all in, because if you're not the guy that's all in, hell, some other guys are going to be. And
yeah, and you're not going to get it. You're not going to get there because of the fact that you're not all in, right?
You might not. Like, maybe you are that guy that has to really push it, and you might have a shorter shelf life. in competing. But if you're holding back because you know of all these like risks that are present, it might just not let you see that fully out. Or you backtrack, like not backtrack, but like what some of these other guys do, or hell, like even like for myself, like 212 versus open, right? Like what makes the most sense versus risk. But I do think it can hold you back in a negative sense too, to where you completely write off that there is a way to do this and just take time with it. Because I see guys that jump out of competing pretty early on and write off like what their ability could really be, what that potential could look like seen out, and they just get out competing and they're like, oh, I don't want to like take the risk with my health. And fair enough point, but there might not be that much more risk taken if you're doing these same things just over time. But again, over time, there's still the problem with it. It's a big question mark, right? Like how much can you do without, having some adverse thing happen? But I think you will get to a point where, and we've had these conversations around where it makes sense to keep going or not. And if, especially you should be chasing this down because you just absolutely love it. And I think if you love it, and it's worth doing to an extent, as long as that's seeing you out to like a greater potential for yourself, greater person in all areas, pursue it. I think that's a rare thing that people get a chance to do in their life versus it's like jumping out to start your own company versus let me just keep working my 9 to 5 because that's safe. Different in bodybuilding, but nonetheless, if that's fulfilling you, like at that moment, you should chase it down, even if you're not going to be the upper echelon in competing. Because it might lead to other things where you can continue developing yourself, right?
Yeah. It's that enjoyment on the day-to-day, right?
Yeah.
Of like, you should enjoy the day-to-day more than you enjoy the goal.
Yeah, you just don't know. There's just a lot of unknowns, right? Like people are more informed. They're going to hold back on maybe pursuing competing because of the risk of health. Oh, what about when I'm 90 years old? What's that going to be like? But then you see some guy pass away the next day that got hit by a car or something, and you're like, geez, well, I should live the fullest every day. But that doesn't mean like go empty your bank account and travel the world. There's a balance to strike there of not being overly so safe to where you live this mundane, unfulfilling life, but also not completely risk adverse where you're, throwing everything to the wind and, making a lot of damage for yourself. But either way, I think, reeling the conversation back in, going to open bodybuilding, it's highly likely there is more risk. Just being a large bodied individual for years on years end, there's probably more risk there because we even see with just disease states, deaths in general, like high body weights are not the healthiest thing for anyone. So there's a potential risk there that might be diverting people away from pursuing open. But I think I still go back to classic because I think that's still the stalemate a lot of people fall into because they can't push up to that level of size. But I have to bring the fact that I see classic guys running just as much gear, but they do keep lighter body weights. Another consideration you brought up, Luke, earlier was, some of the deaths we see in bodybuilding are around showtime and making weight. I see insane things done for classic guys to make weight. Arguably, that's more unhealthy than just say, hey, if you love to compete, just do open. And maybe you won't be the most competitive guy ever, but maybe it's far less risky than doing, 4 classic shows a year and having to suck down and take diuretics and cut water and, beat your kidneys to death.
Yeah, I would 100% agree because I think you're going so far from homeostasis at that point that it's more risk than just letting your body grow into kind of what you want it to do or it wants to do, right? I mean, you talked about this in 212. You talked about this in the last podcast. You felt like this was the first full off season you've had, because you were scared always of going above the 212, and then you ripped down in 21 to how low you got, and you're like, I've got all the room in the world, and just let it flow. And it's like you just can sit there, do the work, and let your body go where it wants, right? And you're not, putting the governors on it, which one improves your day-to-day enjoyment of the process, which improves your day-to-day life. And then two, you're not really, honestly, like it was making 212 was pretty easy still for you. Because this last time, right? But further progress, makes that harder and harder potentially, where that brings about the limit you're in. It's like 212 or open moving forward. And it's like sometimes from a health perspective, it's better to just let it go where it needs to go.
Yeah, it's individual at that point, where are you competitive wise, age wise? Have you pulled out all the variables yet? Does it make sense to move up from there? Also, do you feel like you've done enough in a division to where you can just do this for fun and see out the best version of yourself, right? Or maybe it makes sense to try to be the most competitive still. Like, think of Flex Lewis, like he was in the 220s ready to go, but the most competitive version and build that legacy was still around doing 212 for him. Now, he maybe at after winning 5, you can be like, man, I'm so accomplished in this. Like, I'm going to jump in the open just now for fun. Like, I don't have to push my body. Like, I'm secure. I think he's a different case because he did have so much pressure on him to uphold something. But you have, like, say a lower level, I'm call myself a lower level guy, where I'm not going to be like 7-time 212 champion, where I I've done the Olympia a few times. Like, I'm very happy with what I've done, to where you could walk away and say, yeah, 212. Like, I did the competitive aspect. Now I just want to see what my best is that I've ever seen. Maybe that is open. So, and you could be okay with taking like lesser placings. Not saying I'm going to do that, guys. I'm going to go win some fucking open shows and put them on. But just there's lots to think about around that. A great example too, I was talking to Giles with MD, and he said Kamal is doing Masters Olympia, and he's like 51, and he said, like, for him to get down to 212 it's quite a bit on his body, being older as well. And also he's done open, and he saw like this look that he's like, man, I love the way I look, and it's my best that I've been. So for him, he's like, I'm not doing 212 anymore because I just want to see my best on stage. So you have a guy that's like feels accomplished in his competitiveness and just is okay getting on stage and bringing his best, even though he's not going to go, likely be, Mr. Olympia in the open, right? So lots of different individual considerations to make for where you're at. Another thing to bring up, Luke, I think around this too, is that there is no point system anymore this year.
Yeah, we didn't talk about this. So it's like not encouraging people to do a couple shows to earn their points to the Olympia.
You have to win a show. So I mean, that's pretty intimidating, I think, because what is the ultimate goal of competing is to win a show and go to the Olympia. So if you're like feel that far away from it and you couldn't get like a few like 3rd, 4th places and just get some points to go, it's kind of discouraging for these guys to want to even compete and just stay in the off season and grow to a point where they could knock out and try to get an open win, which that might pull the numbers down as well. Do
you feel like this year is a transition year then?
Transition in what way?
As in, like, it's low because of all these variables coming together.
I think we'll see the numbers pick up next year. I do. You saw that huge flux last year, and now it's pulled back, which kind of makes sense. And then I think if they keep the Olympia at the same time again, you're going to have a normal competitive schedule. Also, we're going to have a normal amount of shows too, because I know people are saying like there's way too many shows happening, But I count up the 212 like calendar year, and there's 20 shows where you could get a first place and get to Olympia. So you're going to have the 20 best guys for 212 going to Olympia. That's very reasonable numbers. So I don't think that's too many shows. I think that's just right to represent the elite on stage. And I think that's going to be a little bit easier layout once we see a normal calendar year for everyone. But prior to that, that was the problem, is you had a big calendar year with more than 20 shows and a point system. So you see so many guys that are qualifying. So yeah, I think it's a good way to go. It's tough. I would want to. Don't get me wrong, I've been to Olympia off points, but definitely would rather go off a win. It's tough with strategy wise, because we look at the calendar year and some of the guys wait to the end to compete. So you might have like we're going to see in probably Texas, the Texas Pro potentially. It could be Hunter, Andrew Jack. We have Carlos. What's Carlos's last name? Yeah, Carlos Thomas. Who knows who else could show up? Like some very competitive guys all in one class. Like you could easily say like Andrew, Hunter, and Carlos. You might want to see all those guys at the Olympia, but only one gets to go. If they don't plan to do another show, you might have cut out some true like Olympia caliber guys versus like Vancouver had 6 guys in it or something. And nothing to take away from these guys, but if you don't have some of the real Olympia caliber guys are waiting to the one show to do, you might get some guy going to Olympia that isn't quite ready for it yet. So you have to be a bit more strategic with picking your shows, which is also very tough when you're an open guy and you have this tight 1-year timeline to try to improve as well. So I think that's where you have like you might sit out a year just to try to improve. But do you think removing the points was a good call?
I like it because for 2 reasons. It pushes people into improving if they're not at the level that they can win, which I think is better for the long-term duration of competitors. And when we talk about like being able to compete for years upon years, I do also think, to your point, that it does kind of pull the best out of people in that everyone's going to Olympia knowing they're a winner at a show, and that it's like the collection of the winners throughout the year, right? And that's kind of where I kind of like that rather than the point system, because you get these people sneaking in who just were able to do a bunch of shows throughout the year. And to your point, from a caliber perspective, like they may have at a bigger show placed 8th, but they got 2nd, 3rd, 4th at all these smaller shows with points. And even though there is levels to these shows where points are distributed at different amounts, these people are still racking up these points just doing a bunch of shows, and from a caliber perspective aren't quite there yet. So I think it adds value to the Olympia. It makes it more special again, and that's the way it should be, in my opinion.
Yeah, I skipped the 2022 Olympia, and I have no regrets about it, because to get on stage with 30 guys, it didn't seem that special anymore. I mean, don't get me wrong, like the cream rises to the top, right? Like the top 10 guys at the Olympia are going to be phenomenal. But to be amongst like 30 guys, you're like, is this still the best of the best in the world? It didn't feel as much that way. Especially, it's a different feeling too going off points. I've done both. And to win a show, you feel like you've earned it versus just getting off points. Now, hey, I was 9th that year at the Olympia that I went off points. So you might be that guy that's still really good. You're just getting 2nd places, and you can beat guys on other days, right? You have guys that beat you at a show, and that happened, but I beat them at the Olympia. So it provides some opportunities, but I still agree, because if you're the guy that you have some Olympia guys show up and you don't get first. Well, you just do more shows, which you would be doing anyway if you had the point system still in place. So it's like Hassan, right? Hassan, he did 3 shows and he won the last one. If he was going off points, he would still probably have done 3-4 shows and maybe would he be able to go off points that way. So it kind of works out to be the same, but I guarantee he feels a lot different winning that show going into Olympia versus having done 3 shows and getting a few second places and going based around that. So, yeah, I think it's a good way. I think it's a good setup in that sense. But yeah, Classic at Tampa, there's still like 30 Classic guys doing it.
Yeah, the classes for Classic are getting ridiculous. It's like it's not even just at the pro level. Like Nationals last year and even the year before that, the year Mitch competed. I don't even know what year that was. 21? Yeah. There's 38 guys in his class or 40.
Yeah, in his height, right?
Class, in his height.
Class,
in his
whatever,
height.
it was C or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's like
wild.
Individual presentations for Class C went 40 minutes. It's like you're on stage for like an hour and a half.
And that's a great example of that used to be bodybuilding. Even when I did USAs in 16, the light heavies, they had like 5 call-outs.
Oh, light heavies. The old light heavyweight classes. Oh,
huge.
I remember walking into NPC Nash. This is like early bodybuilding memories coming back. Like 2014, 2015, going to Miami for MC Nationals, walking in with the light heavyweights on class, and it's like 5 rows deep on both sides of the stage.
Yeah. If you're winning bodybuilding shows back then, you were like, this is a big deal. Now it's so thinned out. It takes away some of the prestige of it, right? And so I think you see that in Classic now. If you win in Classic at Nationals, like, yeah, you're pretty legit. But I think you now have to go back and make it special again to build up the stock, right? Because for open bodybuilding, they were that deep, and it would also just be the overall winner at USA's. Like, wow, like one pro out of that show. So I think, yeah, it depends where you want to take it, right? If you have a big pool of guys competing, like that's fine and all, but it's still like only that first place guy at a pro show is going to go to the Olympia. So should you scale back the number of pro cards being given out earlier on, and then that kind of builds up the quality in the earlier ranks to where when they do come into the pro ranks, they're more competitive right off the bat. Because I think you see that now in the open, right? You'll have a guy that could turn pro, but he's just not ready for the open level to step on stage. When it used to be like, man, if you turn pro at Nationals or USAs or whatever, you pretty much could step onto the open stage and fit in, be in place. Now it's not quite like that. Rarely. So I guess with Classic, you could say like, hey, it's okay to have people turning pro because the stock is so big. But to build up bodybuilding, maybe that is make it more restricted, right? Maybe it's top 3 overall or something. Potentials.
Yeah, I just miss walking into seeing a light heavyweight class and then being like 4 rows deep, and then a heavyweight class that's like 3 rows deep, and then even supers being, 4 or 5 call outs before you get through all the guys.
Yeah, and that's also another conversation, Luke, around delayed gratification. Yeah, I think culturally that's a change too. I know that's like you're opening up a can of worms with that of like people want the immediate, like how many people come to me like, hey, I want a pro card this year. That wasn't even thought of when I was competing. It was like, this is a 5-6 year journey to maybe be in the mix for that, and realizing that's the time we need to set aside. So I feel like there's a lot of everyone's just competing and to not set aside the time to actually grow and develop into that. But I guess that's the question. Is open bodybuilding, is it the death of it? No. I think there's always going to be that avenue. It's still one of the biggest draws from an audience standpoint because people still come for the freak show. We want to see the craziest shit that's out there, right? We want to see the biggest, strongest fighters just duke out in a cage. We want to see human mammoth men, overly muscled, like competing. It's still a big draw. Classic's going to be a big draw from just the actual competitor point, an audience around the competitors that go. But I just don't think it's the death of open. But it's just not what it's going to used to be at the lower ranks. It's just going to take a while to like. It's still the cream rise to the top, so it just might be farther up to the top where you have to see that upper echelon of what an open bodybuilder truly is. Well, if you have a comment below of why you think the ranks are thinning out in open bodybuilding, is it the death of open bodybuilding? Let us know. We'll talk to you next time, guys.